everyone. Welcome to all of our participants in this afternoon's webinar. My name is Amy Willis, and I want to welcome you on behalf of EconLib and Liberty Fund. And I especially want you to help me welcome my friends Arnold Kling and Max Borders and Martin Gurry, who will be here shortly, who've agreed to lead off our discussion. For those of you who are in our webinar, what's going to happen for the Q&A period is I'm going to monitor the chat box. So if everybody, a good experiment might be for you to try to raise your hand now. And I can see you up there. You go. I see Tom's got his hand raised, and Steve and John and Dennis. All right, you guys got it. Who else do we have here? Drea. Okay, so Vance, Ryan, Pedro. All right. I see people are figuring out Lisa. Okay, great. Brennan, awesome. When you have a question at any time during the conversation, please feel free to put it in the chat box. You can send it directly to me if you want. I'm Amy Willis, or you can send it to the whole group. I'm going to monitor that, and as our panel finishes up their conversation, I'll unmute you and ask you to go ahead. I'll say, okay, Tom, or Paul, or Ryan, or Dennis, it's your turn to ask the question. So just give me sort of a hint what you want to ask about, so we can maximize our time if we have repeat questions and that sort of thing. So in a moment here, I'm going to turn it over to Arnold to kick off our panel. We'll make sure that we get Martin in here as soon as we possibly can. You can all go ahead and lower your hands. If not, I will do that for you, so you're ready to join the conversation. And with that, I think, Arnold, I'll turn it over to you. Thank you so much.
Okay, so the book we're discussing is by Balaji, Srinivasan, and it's called The Network State. I was kind of automatically interested because I've been interested for a long time, as Max has, I think, in sort of alternative methods of governance, and looking for ways to make governance more competitive. So but I found that that just about every page in the book has some provocative statement or interesting insight. So I kind of liked everything about it except for his sort of main thesis, which is that a network state is now a live possibility. And I want to kind of throw out three worlds, and maybe use that as a way of saying why I'm skeptical that we're kind of ready for the network state. And when you talk about a network state, you really, Balaji really means that you are not limited to a physical state. You don't have to, you can be in one physical location and have your citizenship, in effect, be in a different location. And it just seems to me like we're kind of not there yet. And so let me lay out I got kind of three worlds. First world is I'll call snail mail world, and the second world I'll call email world, and the third I'll call augmented reality world. So snail mail world is the world we were in, let's say in 1970, when digital communication really didn't exist for all practical purposes. Computers couldn't talk to one another, and we couldn't communicate via computers. We had only analog communication. So we had televisions, which were analog. We had telephones, which were analog. So we didn't have digital communication. And I call it the snail mail world because long distance communication was slow and expensive, which was the case with snail mail. If you wanted to send a letter overseas, you had to pay extra for an airmail stamp, and even then it would take several days to reach its destination. And that may seem, I don't know whether that seems like a big deal or not, but I think it made a huge difference in the world, and I think it made a lot of the differences that Martin Gurry talks about in his Revolt of the Public, made those differences possible. The augmented reality world, since I like to dance, I like to, my vision of if augmented reality works, I can dance where I am and feel like I'm attending a session miles away in a different city, and feel like I'm there and feel that I get the energy there. So that's my challenge to augmented reality. And how it relates to Balaji's book is that I think we really have to be a lot closer to success in augmented reality if we're going to really be able to create a state in which I can be located here, and let's say for all practical purposes, all my government obligations are to Estonia or Singapore or some other distant location. So that's kind of my long-term objection to it. But so then why don't I dismiss the book altogether? And I think it's because the email world, the progress from snail mail to email, has left a lot of traditional governments and institutions in awkward positions. I was starting to feel that way 20 years ago when the internet first came on, when we first became aware of it, or 20, 25 years ago. Starting to feel that, these institutions which looked, these hierarchical institutions with a lot of structure and planning and organization seem sort of obviously necessary in the snail mail world. You couldn't organize, or that's not the term, organize. You couldn't stimulate, let's say, a demonstration or a political cause without some kind of organization, planning, and structure. You needed, every political movement needed something like a Weberian bureaucracy, and somebody who was the head of it, and somebody who was making the plans for it, somebody who was raising the money for it. You couldn't just create a video and distribute it. You had to find your way to a television station. There was the old line, there was freedom of the press for the people who own one. And it was hard to own one back in those days. So we have created a different world from the snail mail world. And I think that's what's causing a lot of increased frustration with the bureaucratic approaches of government and so on. So maybe I haven't prepared Max for this, but I'll throw on him the question of, how strong is the case for alternatives to the nation state in our current world? I mean, I think you've been looking into it for a while, and Balaji makes the point, like, imagine it was as hard to start a business today as it is to start a new state. How pathetic our market system and business system would be if it were that difficult. And so he's trying to make the reverse case. Suppose it was as easy to start a new state as it is to start a business. And I know you've thought about that and sort of what the benefits would be. And I'm wondering if you could put your thoughts on.
Sure. I I don't think I have as strong of an objection to the core premise that you do, Arnold. And I want to make sure I understand your objection, and that is that there is, in some sense, a lot of there are important features of governance that attach to terra firma and in-person interaction. So then I would say, back to that, what precisely can we pick out those features that are necessary to that sort of interaction? and or necessary to that form of institutional substrate being developed, right? So one of the in the early days, and in fact, you were one of the big influences in this way. You introduced me back in probably 2007 to the ideas of Albert Hirschman, exit, voice, and loyalty. And so, that was really meaningful to me. And in setting down that road, it occurred to me at the time to draw a distinction between what I called then territorial goods and non-territorial goods. So what are the features of governance in some institutional substrate? Because we need rules to live by. I don't think anybody denies that. Even anarchists are want rules, they just don't want rulers. So the idea there is, if you have some institutional substrate, some governing set of rules, and they need to have some associated enforcement mechanism, right? Is that enforcement mechanism? Is that really what's, the part that's attached to terra firma? And to what degree do we already have these sort of, contractual, international, interstate, and otherwise relationships that don't require so much of a, territorial layer, okay? The thing about Balaji's analysis that I find compelling is that he brings in his entrepreneurial lens, but he also brings his techie lens. So he tends to think of things in terms of a stack, of a technological stack, right? If we click out a couple of orders of magnitude from that, you can imagine different layers of a great social stack, and he thinks about culture and nation on the one hand, states and administrative apparatuses on the other. He thinks about the kinds of governance that happen that are necessary on the ground, and the kinds of things that can be done in the cloud. And of course, he saw that what happened in 2008, 2009, and I don't just mean the financial collapse, but he also observed that what happened in that was the response to that in the creation that had aggregated over many years of these basically cypherpunks doing cryptography, culminating in Satoshi Nakamoto's white paper. And that was, for him, a watershed in that governance at scale, internationally, completely distributed, decentralized, whatever term you like, was possible, at least for money. You might not like Bitcoin, you might like other cryptocurrencies, you might not like these currencies at all. That being said, as a proof of concept, he sees it as important as the printing press. And indeed, maybe more important for ushering in the age of network as Leviathan. So my question on this, just to land the plane a little bit and not bang on, is if we're going to take off the table the idea of the interests of the stronger, where the interest of the stronger, where the question is just like, how do we negotiate in all of these Leviathan states with their old school bureaucratic, but kinetic and compulsion powers? How do we navigate in an environment, in a cloud space that allows us to establish contractual relationships between and among peoples, in such a way that you get this forking and merging, or if you like, exit, voice, and loyalty dynamic really at play? And he sees that we're just in our nascency, or maybe our adolescence, for that era. And so there's a lot of promise in Balaji for that. But I do acknowledge your point, that is, there may be more to in-person interaction or territorial goods than he's giving credit to these legacy states. I'll just leave it at that.
Like, just to take a concrete example, like the one question that he never raises, much less answers, is how do, let's say somebody creates a network state and I say, boy, I really, that's for me. How do I exit from Montgomery County, Maryland, USA, to get to that state? And so I think of all the negotiation that would be required. For example, I'm still going to use the roads here.
Mhm.
Children are still going to use the parks here. Still going to have to get my trash collected somehow. So a lot of those things just do seem place-based. I mean, I can't, I can understand, I don't need to go to a physical bank. I mean, that's true nowadays. Just half an
True.
hour before this, I took a picture of a check and deposited at the bank. And there's just that's already done. I mean, we've already moved banking to the metaverse, so to speak. But there are still, like you say, territorial goods that you can't, and there are still relationships that that have to be negotiated, and that's what strikes me as unrealistic. We have to be able to move a lot more activities to the metaverse so that I don't need to use the roads, I don't need to have my trash picked up and so on.
Well, I don't infer from Balaji's thesis that all governance would exist in the cloud. And if you bring back the stack metaphor, if you think of it in terms of a tech stack, or not a tech stack, but the kinds of things you need to do at scale and do locally and territorially. You mentioned a bunch of things that can probably be handled by your county. And so he might agree that, ideally you have decentralization of jurisdictions, that are bounded on land would be good for these specific kinds of goods and services. And you might want to contract with a private city provider to live in a jurisdiction. You might choose to go to somewhere else that has traditional public services and so on. But these smaller jurisdictions, if there's some sort of subsidiarity rule or some sort of, federalism, give you more options for exit. The way he's imagining it is that there would be this, crowdfunding territory, which he calls the archipelagos.
Okay.
Right.
So
The
right.
archipelagos being these proto network. And
Yeah.
I think your objection is not hey, this isn't justifiable in some abstract sense of like morality or politics, but rather, what the hell are we going to do about the Leviathan powers currently sitting on all of this land?
Yeah.
And I think you're right in that diplomatic recognition of these archipelagos is pretty weak. The UN has a right to self-determination in the UN Charter very early on, and yet the United Nations is only like 190 something countries, 198. And yet, if there were people who could self-determine, like the Basques, like the so on and so forth, there would probably the Kurds, there would probably be 600 nations. If just based on people who self-identifies, culturally, ethnic, and so on. So he believes that this process of forming the network first, which are these moral cultural enclaves, will be these proto-network states, but they will be hybrid, and they will be eventually come back down to terra firma in some sense. But you're right, based on this idea, unless we have a huge sea change in our psychology about network states, this is probably a little bit pie in the sky.
Yeah. Well, maybe one vision would be that, you could imagine a world in which these local government services like trash collection or road maintenance are the equivalent of, homeowners associations, right? They don't have the fundamental significance that the government seems to have. So maybe you don't need anything more than a homeowners association to provide territorial services. That would be an optimistic take. But still, if you go through the exercise, how do I exit my existing government obligations? Because I think that's an important exercise. Otherwise, I'm just kind of adding a new government, not and not changing it. For example, how do I negotiate out of Social Security or Medicare? If I'm young, I would love to just stop paying taxes on, to support all the old people. As an old person, I'm not sure how I feel about exiting Medicare. I might want to, might not. But though, there are these, for better or worse, some, very uh, tight bonds between the government and its citizens. It's got its claws in a lot of things, and that process is quite difficult. You may know that I wrote years ago this what I call the widely unread, Unchecked and Unbalanced, which started out as a book about. It was pointing out that the power that government officials have is enormous relative to the power of the biggest corporations in terms of just the amount of money they could allocate and so on. And so I suggested a solution for that would be to somehow make it easier for people to exit these monopoly governments that have all this power. If you could make government more competitive, that work. But I recognized at the time the big challenge is sort of negotiating out of existing arrangements like Social Security, or if you're going to contract with a private police force or a private garbage company, or how you would unbundle all these services. Because right now, government, you can think of it as a very highly bundled system, and you would say, well, I would like to take this, but I would I would like to not take that. Government deliberately makes it very hard to do that. And so it seems to me that just to make exit feasible, you would have to build mechanisms that allow people to unbundle government services and say, no, I don't want this from you. I'd rather have it from somebody else. So somebody could say, I don't want my financial regulation from the US. I want it from Estonia. Or, but the process, creating that kind of negotiation mechanism seems like the big challenge to creating an environment in which government can truly be much more competitive than it is today.
Yeah, so you're probably this is a little bit of Coase. Forgive me, I'm the sort of armchair or the fly on the wall in economics compared to you, but I do know enough to be dangerous and probably disastrously wrong. But I think about Coase and the idea of transaction costs, and then I think about, and I'll get back to that in a moment. And then I think about, the Mansur Olson's idea of concentrated benefits, diffuse costs. And we're one of the dynamics that we're starting to see is an inversion of concentrated benefits, diffuse costs, where the costs of enforcement are increasing and centralized, and the benefits are diffuse. And an early example of this is, for example, in 2012, the idea of hitching a ride with someone and paying them for it was crazy. But you had massive constituencies suddenly using this app, Uber, that was operating in legal gray areas, right? So if we think about all of these systems as being unbundled for a moment and not letting the perfect be the enemy of the good, you can think of it as in terms of single issue stuff. How you can opt out of taxi cab cartels is by doing business with Uber, which facilitates a platform that lets you do business with individuals with cars. We no longer think of that as hitching a ride. We think of that as commonplace today. And there was institutional change. It's not perfect, but it was one of those 2 steps forward, one step back. And now, we have a little bit of an equilibrium with respect to that. We also have a lot of that are doing stuff like school choice things, which, if in some ideal world, one didn't want any of their resources going to education at all, except for maybe to their kids, you'd have a completely private system. But short of that, you would have something like school vouchers, and more and more states are adopting vouchers and tax credits and so on, so that you have that possibility for exit. They're institutionalizing that right of exit. And the more you get these giant constituencies around some of these measures, whether they're done via the private sector in legal gray areas or done legally through channels, democratic channels such as, state legislatures, you may slowly start to see these constituencies are more and more difficult to deal with because they are so massive. Now, that's not to say that the government couldn't get really draconian and really totalitarian tomorrow, but with Bitcoin, with Uber, with school choice, there's so many of these areas of subversive innovation that are some top down, some bottom up, and some a little bit of both, that are allowing de facto exit rights. And it may be that what Balaji's looking at is a trend towards more and more of these things coming online. Because when those constituency groups see that overwhelming value in the new system, and then there's some authority that's trying to take it away, it becomes politically more difficult to enforce the old order in that case. And we've seen that with Uber. And frankly, we've seen it with Bitcoin.
Yeah.
Gentlemen?
No, Uber is an interesting case. Amy, are you ready?
Yeah, I think this is a
some...
good time to introduce one of our questions. Our friend John Nye has some interesting questions and comments, and I'm going to go ahead and open up his audio. You guys have been talking a lot about the sort of individual levels of negotiation that would be necessary. And John has some questions. I think, John, I think you can go ahead now.
Hi. One of the things I think techies tend to do is overestimate how difficult these shifts are. You give the examples of Uber and Bitcoin. And as you know, China has regulated the heck out of Bitcoin. And Uber is in retreat in many small countries because the governments have essentially forced them to sell out to local companies. Good examples were Russia, the Philippines, but I could name you a dozen other examples that over the last decade, the burden of dealing with local regulations got so high that a local competitor pushed them out, and Uber chose to sell out. Even in the US, you've seen all sorts of regulation. You are missing all the different ways in which choice is cut down. I believe Colorado is now pulling back some of their school choice, by trying to redefine who is homeschooled and what counts as homeschooling. So there are a large number of these things, and the US is the most open. I guess as a historian, I would emphasize that what you're describing in its most utopian form is equivalent to the shift from feudalism to the modern state. And that shift did not take place until a large group of elites with power were willing to fight for it. And what you really had is the two elites, the legacy elites of the feudals and the new elites of the moderns, fought it out all over Europe with huge casualties. And the masses were used as fronts for both of the struggles, whether it was relatively peaceful as in England, but even in England wasn't peaceful, right? You have to understand that the enclosure movement disenfranchised millions of people of their feudal rights. So that the beginning of the liberal state required a Leviathan state. England was the largest growing central state in the 18th century. They had higher tax collection than France. And they had more of a central state than anyone had ever seen in the history of Europe. In contrast, because France had less of a centralized state, it led to the French Revolution. And then you had the Napoleonic Wars, which allowed feudalism to be transmuted in places like Germany, etc. So I think you underestimate the extent to which This is not just about an obvious case like we'll give these benefits, people will see, and then people will rally around. These are negotiated on multiple levels. Furthermore, having been an advisor to relatively poor countries, what I'm quickly learning is that vested interests in poor countries aren't stupid. Economists often go to these countries and say, let's have free trade or let's get rid of their tariff. But when I go in and dig into the actual details, what they've done is they've layered the regulations such that if you say remove officially tariffs, even if you can do that, they have so many layers of other things which serve as equivalent barriers that it's very hard to dig out what's going to happen. And therefore, I see the transition to a network state more like we're in the first phase in which we get used to the technology and which we use it on very minor things, relatively minor things, I would say. And I think that will take 100 years at least just to work out the technological details and get people used to that. Then I think you'll see the wars of religion.
Well,
John,
there's an optimistic view.
Yeah, I don't think you're wrong about this at all. About the not only the way history is unfolded, and acknowledging some of the patterns of two steps forward, one step back. I for one, and I wouldn't say Balaji is either, some sort of overly sanguine, utopian about this. More to try to sketch out how something like this could begin to unfold, recognizing all the while that both special interests and the powerful have every incentive to make sure that it doesn't unfold. So I absolutely think you're right, and that being said, that I don't think that should make us stick our heads in the sand and say, oh well. If indeed that anybody sees value in this kind of transition, I for one do see a value in such a transition. So I'm perhaps more optimistic than you, but I'm under no illusions.
Let me add one more thing. I think you overvalue how stable the current system is. I think the UN has very little power to preserve physical legacy states. Almost entirely, the power was maintained by a half dozen of the most militarily powerful countries in the world. And the fact that the US is the only hegemon, that is to say, a country with the gap in military power between first and second place was so large in human history, which did not use that power to aggrandize at a massive scale. As we're seeing now in Ukraine, when a major power challenges, given they have nuclear force, even the standard legacy states don't seem to matter much unless the other states are willing to risk nuclear warfare. And my guess is that the biggest challenge to existing legacy states, and by definition, a transition to network states, would be what China does. If we get wars involving Russia and China, you will find a lot of the so-called interconnectedness will disappear. Even before we get interconnectedness, we're going to see globalization disappear.
That gets back to another book I reviewed, Peter Zion's book. Amy, you have another questioner?
I will pop a link to the Zion review, and I was nodding my head for that. In the meantime, Drea, I enabled your audio. Drea has a question for all of you, including for John. So, and then we'll go to Tom Gray, who also has a question. Go ahead, Drea.
Okay, great. Hi, John. I'm curious, you talked about sort of this 100-year transition of experiments. And I think what I struggle with is understanding what that roadmap looks like. What do you think are some viable places of experiments?
I guess to answer quickly, what I'm saying experiment is just getting everything to work the way techies think it works. Look at the difficulty the government is still having just setting up basic websites. My son is a programmer, and he says the multiple ways in which programming is done so poorly and how badly websites are set up is running against budget constraints, and then the extent to which these have to be layered over paper documents which are backups to these things. And remember, we are the most advanced, or one of the 2 or 3 most advanced states in the world. Most of the real experiments in what you want are being done by smaller states. So probably Switzerland and Luxembourg and Singapore have a better shot at doing the experiments with the technology and putting into place some aspects of the network state that can then spring on the world like printing. I think, if going back to our discussion, a few months ago, we had the chat, Arnold, you'll remember, on North Wallace and Weingast. And one of the things they talk about, the transition to the modern liberal state, came about first because private elite institutions, such as courts in Italy, that is to say, many of the details of what we now think of as modern court law were worked out by a system of courts and judges that was initially designed just to facilitate trades between elite families in the Genoese city-states. It is once those institutions got well used by the elites and served their interests, did they spread to the masses, and that's the sense in which modern techie optimistic is useful, because it allows figuring out ways to use this technology, spread it, get it to be more bug-free. And then that allows it to gradually diffuse, or sometimes rapidly, as with the case of cell phones, to the vast majority. And that's what I mean by you see these experiments. I will leave it to the authors now, to the host to discuss this.
Thanks, John. Thanks, Drea. Max and Arnold, do you want to jump in, and then we'll have Tom ask his question?
Well, I think we have some interesting case studies to talk about. I mean, cryptocurrency more broadly is, clearly in an experimental phase, and it's interesting to see how that plays out. Uber is a very fascinating case study in that, in order to get a foothold, they've been willing to just lose money and lose money and lose money, in the hopes that they will develop such a strong constituency that they won't come in and be regulated. But even so, like I guess in California, there's these gig worker laws that are sort of throwing sand in the gears there. I think this just confirms Max's point that this could be a long slog to get some of these changes in.
Yeah, I wouldn't mind just quickly saying, first of all, just in response to John's objection to me that I was under the illusion that the UN has any power. I'm not. I certainly don't think it does. I think it has only that much power that it can facilitate corruption, probably. But I don't think it has power really at all. What I was pointing out is that the UN pays lip service to this idea of self-determination. It's written in the charter, and it's supposedly a feature of international law. Diplomatic relations being a way that states or nation states acknowledge each other's existence. But as I said, if the UN were all that powerful, we would have 600 nation states, because that Leviathan force would have ensured the self-determination of the Basques, of the Kurds, and so on. So I don't know where you got from me anyway that the UN is powerful or that it ought to have power. I certainly don't think it should. I don't even think it should exist, but that's another story. I am also totally agree with you about the fact that the United States has been a global hegemon pretty much up to this point, and it looks like that may be changing, and we could I'm sure you guys will talk to Peter Zeihan at some point in the future. I hope you do, or Zeihan. I will, however, mention that there are some other. We don't need to talk completely about stuff in the cloud. And I know Balaji isn't, that's one part of the stack for Balaji, and an important one. But another part of the stack is this idea of the archipelagos, and perhaps prior to that, the idea of special economic zones. I mean, we've seen Singapore, and these are a mixture of bottom up and top down, right? So we've seen Singapore, we've seen Hong Kong, we've seen Shannon, we've seen, you know, some of the new efforts that are probably not going to work, but I hope they do, in Honduras, such as Prospera. We have, you know, Dubai. I mean, there are really good examples of these small nation states that, you know, by virtue of, you know, colonial powers pulling away, or in virtue of there being, you know, some opportunity to, some need arises for them to develop their own small level sovereignty, they've done that. Some of those are for historical reasons, and some of them are, to your point, designated by Leviathan powers and allowed to happen, allowed to emerge. But that is, you know, I think what one of Balaji's points is, when you start to develop communities of practice, cultural and otherwise, those communities can, you know, at least have the possibility of being the next Dubai, even if in an archipelago, and even if there is a layer of the stack that is more in cloud governance and otherwise terra firma.
Yeah, of course, several years ago, everyone wanted to be the next Hong Kong, and now nobody wants to be the next Hong Kong. So
Yeah, they got run over.
all right, can we get to Tom then?
If you go ahead and unmute yourself, you should be able to talk.
Okay, now I can
There you
talk.
go.
I might be one of the few people who is a US citizen living in a foreign country, and I wanted to point out that the EU, as Max sort of pointed out on self-determination in the UN, the EU has subsidiarity as a huge issue, where there's the union and then the nation states, and there's a constant nation state versus centralized EU argument going on in the EU, that the people wanting more subsidiarity in the UK were so unsatisfied that they left the EU. And the subsidiarity is a good idea, but in practice, the centralizing forces of the elites continues to be very, very strong. But one of the counters to the centralizing forces is the, to me, kind of annoying idea of focus on inequality, where part of the inequality talk is to have costs, focused costs on the billionaires, the super rich, the top 1%, with the diffuse benefits of whether it's UBI at a basic level or a comfortable level or something, but lots of benefits, and you get a democratic support for that redistribution. And the issue that I find with respect to Balaji, the network state idea is, why are the rich people going to go into the network state if they go into it? And it's to get away from the taxes. But if the reason the rich go into it is to get away from the taxes, it's never going to be allowed by the democracies. So I find the tax collection and the taxing issues completely crucial to that aspect of the deletes. On the other hand, as mentioned, if you believe in God, there are the Amish in the US, there's Rod Dreher's Benedict option idea of getting Christians, believers, to have small communities. I was thinking about the Orthodox Jews in New York City. Could they be the beginning of a network state? And they maybe could be, but they will certainly exist, paying taxes to the local people, whoever they are. And I pay Slovak taxes also. So that was my comment. Taxes are I didn't see all of the tax ramifications, but I think they're going to be crucial.
Yeah, that's what goes to my point, that exiting, that the process of negotiating an exit is quite difficult. And I think we're seeing issues of that now. There's a lot of concern that, that rich people could become expats, and then there are people proposing laws that they then be taxed when they leave. And I think I think California has thought about that seriously, of saying, okay, go ahead and leave, but we're going to impose a tax on you. Of course, there are all these, I'm sure there are lots of legal and constitutional issues that, but those are the types of issues that I think, if a network, you mentioned things like Amish or Orthodox Jews or Christians who want to kind of, separate from some of the things they don't like in the cultural trends. They can do that, but they're still, as you say, under the overall government of the territory. And so in that sense, they represent kind of an additional government. I mean, if I were to, try to join the Amish, I don't know if I can, or try to join the Orthodox Jews, and I know I wouldn't qualify at this point for that. I could adopt a new set of rules, but I wouldn't be escaping very many old ones. Amy, you have somebody else on the queue?
I do. I have John and Drea again. So John, you want to go, and then we'll have Drea go after you?
Oh, I don't want to say too much. I just wanted to point out that the US already has, IRS has rules that it determines if it determines that you have left your citizenship to avoid taxes, they can tax you for up to 5 years after leaving. And I believe, I forget his name. I think it's Sabareed, but I'm not sure. One of the founders of Facebook, when he moved to Singapore, got hit that 5-year tax. The reason most countries don't have it is that they simply can't enforce the rules. So again, we're back to the issue of enforcement and what Leviathans will allow you to do. And of course, that's the same thing with Hong Kong. Moreover, Singapore today seems like a success, but note that Singapore toes the party line on everything from China, because they know that since they're so dependent on trade, anything China does to upset that trade will hurt them. So Singapore is one of the most pro-members of the Association of Southeast Asian, pro-Chinese members of the Association of Southeast Asian Nations. Any kind of disturbance, for example, even a mild clash in Taiwan, will dramatically affect the GDP of Singapore. So it tailors its policy to that.
Drea, go ahead.
Sure. I think I'm going to be beating a dead horse. I'm really glad that Arnold brought up this issue of additive versus removing issues. And I enjoyed John's example of the courts and sort of elite Italian courts of they were adding something that the existing governance didn't provide. Is there anything that a Balaji model network state can add? The closest examples he comes up with are, the keto thing, which I would think is a much like, Orthodox Judaism. It's like, here's additional constraints we want to live under. Or can we avoid, say, the FDA regulations? And all of that strikes me as you have to have such an enormous state that the economy within that network state self-sustains, could sustain, for example, a pharmaceutical industry. Good luck with that. So I'm curious about what other options, what other ideas are floating around of additive value.
My guess is from the crypto world, there are a lot, the decentralized finance would qualify. The ability to, transfer money across borders, across national borders, is something that community touts, and that some countries, it's very important. Apparently, Argentina would be an example of that.
I actually,
At some point, but I know we're getting close to 2 o'clock, and I'd like to put it out there. At some point, I'd like to hear sort of what from people, they can either in the chat or email, sort of what excited them and what concerned them about the way this panel went, so that we know how to improve it for next time. So any feedback like that would be appreciated, or if people want to stick around for a few minutes after 2 to voice their views. Okay, so now, Max, you had something to say?
yeah, I just, I hate to be, I'm generally optimistic in support of this vision of a network state. And yet I I actually think that it's going to take some sort of institutional collapse to really avail yourself of it. The old mayor of Chicago, when he was in the Obama administration, his name escapes me, you know what I mean?
Emmanuel, was that?
Emmanuel, yeah, Rahm Emanuel said something along the lines of never let a good crisis go to waste. And I think, you know, some sort of, you know, sovereign defaults, some sort of international financial contagion, you know, there, you know, some sort of reduction in state capacity that happens for some awful reason will be an entrepreneurial opportunity for subversive innovators who are trying to create these governance niches. Will begin to plant the seeds in that way. If you want to use extend the biological metaphor, you can think of it as like invasive species, where the new institutions start to sprout up in the most unlikely areas, you know, through the cracks of the old order, particularly when those cracks are accelerating because of reduced state capacity. You know, for example, right now here in the United States, we're at what, 138% of GDP, and that does for debt to GDP, that doesn't even include unfunded liabilities. There seems to be no interest whatsoever in figuring out how to wind that back or do anything about it. And unless you're a modern monetary theorist, it seems like this is going to have some sort of expiration date. Japan right now is in very tenuous circumstances financially. What does that look like from the standpoint of entrepreneurs looking to establish parallel institutions where you can begin to have some measure of jurisdictional arbitrage? I hate to sound that way. I hate to be that pessimistic, but you know, the better the old order does, if it starts to rebound, I think actually the less likely you'll get these shoots of possibility.
Yeah, I can't resist bringing up Neil Stephenson's I think it was his first book, Snow Crash, where you know, the president of the United States appears as kind of a joke. We've had to sell the Pentagon to pay off debts, so you know, and so all the governance is by private corporations. So I don't know. It just sounded like that scenario.
There again, I can think of nothing more effective than a state's trying to cling on to power. You know, in terms of effectiveness, history is really given us a lot of those stories too.
Okay, we're about ready to wrap things up and hopefully leave people eager for more.
I think we have one last question or comment from John, and then yeah, I'm happy to, as Arnold said, happy to stick around for a couple minutes after, and I put my email in the chat for all of you.
As a minor Philip on Arnold's point about bankruptcy in the Neil Stephenson story, historically we have two big examples. Elizabeth I went bankrupt and had to, virtually bankrupt, and had to sell all the royal lands and many of the silverware, etc., of the state, of the royal kingdom. Similarly, Louis XIV was in such bad straits at the end of the 18th century that he stopped collecting public accounts data and sold off many things in Versailles today are replacements for all the things that Louis XIV sold off for fiscal reasons. However, I will point out that both those cases of the state going virtually bankrupt led to the growth of the two most powerful entities in Europe for the next 200 years.
John Alcorn.
Well, the major pattern, as far as I can tell, is that a new technology, a disruptive technology emerges. Think, for example, of the internet or crypto. This technology temporarily bypasses the state and accordingly increases entrepreneurial and exit entrepreneurial opportunities and exit options. You know, the internet was the frontier of freedom. But then, you know, now you have big tech firms with major lobbying offices in Washington, D.C., and these industries have to preemptively, you know, there's a game, there's a game of cat and mouse between the state and the entrepreneurs in the new tech industry over regulation and control. And the industry gets in a sense, there's regulatory capture and there's regulation and regulatory capture, but you certainly don't get unbundling. So I guess I'm saying if I'm right about the pattern, is this grounds for pessimism? In a similar vein, John Nye mentioned crisis of the state, conflict, and so on. Robert Higgs' thesis is when that happens, the state gets bigger, after the crisis. So am I wrong to?
It's a great point.
Be more pessimistic in the long term? That's my question.
Well, I seem to always come out pessimistic in public, so I'm not going to add any more fuel to that fire.
I think Max, you might be frozen. Let's see if he had something there.
Oh, I would just say we need our optimism, even if we don't, if it's unjustified, and we need it because we can't just go back to the Viktor Frankl idea, that I mean, think it was, but you just have to persist and power through and sit in that space between stimulus and response that is our response to fear, and then it can sometimes bring about the submission instinct. I think we have to cling to some measure of optimism in all of this while being circumspect and rational about what's possible. The other option is that we have to go back to playing political games that don't seem to work either, which is if we just elect the right person in the right Congress, everything is going to turn out well. And that's certainly never worked either. So I think this is, in general, a much more promising path, despite the setbacks, despite the steps back after 2 forward steps. And I hope that Balaji unleashes a whole slew of these subversive innovators
Thanks, Max.
who are inspired by his work.
On that more hopeful note, at least, we'll close our formal conversation.